lies from God's perspective. That's why they're sin, you see, because fear is lies. Right? When you're at one with God, you don't have any fear. So outside of that, every time you're afraid of something, you're just telling yourself lies all the time. And I'm talking in particular about our emotional fears, not our physical ones. You know, it's wise for you to not consider jumping off a 20-story building, right? Because obviously there's a law involved there that's going to result in some hurt. But for many of you, you see just walking down the road or going shopping or going overseas or getting up in front of a group of people and talking about God's truth, or just somebody thinking that you're a bad person as jumping off of a building would be preferable to you many times. So we've got to remember that basically what we're doing is just telling ourselves lies. Every time we honour the fear that we have within us, particularly our emotional fears, and particularly our fears about experiencing emotion, we're just honouring lies. That's all we're doing. That's how we make fear our God. We just honour a whole heap of lies from God's perspective. From God's perspective, you are totally capable of addressing every single emotion. You're totally capable of experiencing every single one, and you're totally capable of taking action so that you do so. That's God's feelings. And in fact, God even takes it further and says, no, you are personally responsible for all of your feelings. They're in you now. No matter who caused them, no matter who triggered them, no matter what happened to you when you're a child, they're in you now. Does that make sense? There's nothing you can do about them being in you aside from letting them out of you. You can't remove them from your childhood. That experience is already gone. It's already happened. The only thing you can do is do something about them now. Right? And God does expect you to do something about them now. Now, God will give you lots of help to do it. And this is part of coming to trust God. Many of you can't trust God yet because you've yet to fully experience a single emotion, and therefore yet to know what it's like to go through that experience, and therefore yet to know what it's like to fully trust that God made you to go through that experience, and to fully trust God helps you through that experience. Right? So that's an issue. So what happens then is you think you're alone processing emotion, right? And you believe you're alone before you even begin. And the reality is, in your childhood, you certainly were probably alone whenever it came to feeling emotion. Like the majority of families do not support the feeling or expression of emotion in children, particularly when those emotions are in disharmony or disagreement with the parents themselves, with the parents' own emotion. And so the majority of families don't support you feeling emotion, but God does. And so what we end up doing is we grow up believing that no one's going to support us feeling an emotion. And the reality is we then want all sorts of things to help us emotionally. This is why antidepressants are one of the major pharmaceutical manufacturers' dreams at the moment, because half the population is on them, particularly half the Western population. And the reason why is because most of us want to avoid any negative, what we believe is any negative or painful emotion. We'd rather take a pill and be numb to all emotion through that taking of a pill, and numb to all desire, and many of these drugs do cause that. And we're happier doing that so that we can feel stable emotionally. So it's a major problem on this planet, this fear of emotion, a major problem. And the interesting thing is, once you get through it, you know you can deal with anything, right? You know you can handle anything that comes your way. And you think about it, that gives you a lot of confidence, doesn't it? If you knew that, it would give you a lot of confidence about your future. If you knew that you can handle anything, and particularly with God's help, you can handle everything. Right? But most of us don't even get to trust God to that limit, to that length. because we're so stuck on this concept that we have that we've got to avoid emotional pain at all costs. So the soul, the question then becomes, how do we get the soul away from thinking that it has to avoid all pain? It's obviously a feeling in our soul. We've got to do something, don't we, to have this soul change inside of us so that we're no longer wishing to avoid pain. Now, what usually naturally happens is that the pain builds and pain builds and pain builds and pain builds until the pain, we no longer can cope with the emotional pain itself, and then we surrender. That's normally the process that happens. It doesn't have to happen that way, but that's normally the process that happens. So you remember when we channeled persons like Glenn, he said he went through this place where he's numb for years and years, and then he became frustrated and angry, and he'd get exhausted going through that process as well. And eventually he got to just surrender to some tears once, because the pain of where he was at up until that point was so bad that he just finished up surrendering to his tears. And then he realised that's when he made some real shift. Right? Now that is how the average person gets to feel emotion. Now for many of you, even after this discussion, it's going to be after you've died that you'll go through that experience, because you're not choosing to go through it now, and you're still in a lot of resistance to choosing it. You follow? What I would like to see is that you don't wait till then, but you go through it now. You go through the experience now. But most of you don't want to. And this is an issue of your will. So the alternative then, what's the alternative to that? So that's the way it happens for pretty much most people. That's the way it happened for me, to be frank. Like, I got to a point where everything in my life was pretty much destroyed, right? And I had a choice of either dying or deciding to change, right? And then I decided, well, you know, if it was up to me and I probably didn't have children, I probably would have chose to die. That's how much I was avoiding my emotions. But because I had two boys, I decided, well, I can't die and leave them with the thought of that they might be partially responsible for my death, right? So I had to do something about it so that I could live, and that meant choosing to live properly. And so I had to make a choice, a different choice. And the moment I made a different choice, I started taking action. So I went to do body work therapy so that I'd release some emotion, and every time I went there, I'd be allowance of the emotion, and the emotion would release. So I got a bit of help initially, so I couldn't fool myself with my mind and tell myself what things were, and the body work helped me get through that process. And then once I got to the point where I was no longer fooling myself with my mind about what was really inside of me, then the stuff just started coming out by myself. I didn't need anybody else after that doing that for me. You follow? And the question becomes, well, when are you going to do it? Well, are you going to wait like I did until your whole life's pretty much a mess? And for many of you, that with the level of control you have currently of your life, that probably isn't going to happen until after you die. Does that make sense? With the level of control you currently exert over your current life, it's probably unlikely for many of you that you'll go through my experience, because many of you have your life under a semblance of control. And you probably, given the fact that most of you still desire this control, are probably going to maintain that control until you pass. But after you pass, you're going to find that you've got far less control over all of your life. Right? So that's one option. What's the other option? Yeah, the other option obviously is to help do everything you possibly can. Right now, from now on, do everything you possibly can to help your soul change this decision it's made. Can you see? That's the problem. The problem is the decision to avoid pain at all costs. That's the decision we've made. And we need to do things to engage a process that will help the soul get beyond that point, right? And there's all sorts of things you can do that. You can, by educating yourself, reading things, like reading about emotion, reading about emotional experiences, how healing occurs, and so forth. And you can, there's so many things that you could do. I don't know. During that phase, I read so many books. I can't even remember how many of them there are now, because I read one every day or two, like for nearly 2 years, of all about emotions and emotional expression, emotional experience, feeling your desires and passions and all those kind of things. And I got to the point where I was convinced internally that the right thing to do was to experience my pain rather than avoid it. I had to educate myself. And this is what I feel you need to do. You need to educate yourself so that this particular attitude of the soul no longer exists inside of you. Avoid pain at all costs, which is the current attitude that is inside the majority of you. That is the attitude that needs to change. If that attitude changes and all of a sudden you're feeling like, wow, I can experience pain, and experiencing my pain will heal me, and you're convinced about that in your heart, can you see that's going to change quite a lot of things in terms of how you experience emotion, isn't it? Yeah. So, Lani?
So is what you're saying is that, like, you read so many books and you just sort of overwhelmed yourself with all this desire to do this, so that...
No, my desire, my feelings are desire grows over a period of time based on what you educate yourself on. Do you follow what I mean by that?
Yeah.
So if I educate myself in the truth and about how God made the human soul, then eventually I'll come to see how important dealing with my emotions are. Now, if I don't do that education, I will come to convince myself that emotions are completely unnecessary in order to have a connection with God. And as soon as you get to that point, you're lost. Yeah. Right? And there's many people I've talked to in the last 8 years who are now lost because they believe that emotional processing is unnecessary. Right? Yeah. And I'm saying to you, no, sorry, love is an emotion. It has to flow for you to feel it. And you won't feel love flow unless you can feel all of your emotions flow. So it's a very important thing to choose to do, to get away from this cycle of just avoiding pain and avoiding past pain even. The majority of us are not even just choosing to avoid our current, situations that may cause pain. We're avoiding our pain from when we were 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all those formative year pain that occurred. Most of us are choosing to avoid it, right? And that underlying choice that we're making at the soul level can only be triggered by two things. One is that your life gets so terrible that and so out of control that you finish up dealing with it. Now, as I say, if the majority of you leave that decision to when that happens, that'll be after you've passed, right? And that's why, for the majority of people, it is after they've passed that decision is made. The second choice is educate your soul differently. Allow yourself to see the importance of letting go of past pain and the healing effect of it. Look at all of the studies that have been done about it, all of the different, there's been thousands of studies on this planet about it. Right, there's studies on cancer, for example, where they've realised that if they process anger and childhood resentment, that there's a doctor in Germany who heals 90% of cancer without actually giving them any drugs at all, and all he does is help them go through the rage and resentment and the addiction-based interactions they have with their family members. That's all he does. And you look at these studies and in the end you'll be convinced, right? You'll be convinced that avoiding pain is actually detrimental to your health.
So this really needs to be number one priority and to, in our lives if we really want to change?
I don't think it needs to be number one, no. Right? Number one is faith. Number two, truth. Number three, take action. Number four, let yourself feel your emotion. You follow? But without feeling your emotion, no change is possible. Just like without receiving truth, no change is possible. Without having faith, no change is possible. And without taking actions, no change is possible. Right? So these are, I feel, the four things collectively will help you engage your will for positive change.